The moment I think about most, the moment I keep coming back to, even now, months after everything's settled, is not the verdict. It's not the lawyers in their wigs and gowns arguing back and forth across that high-ceilinged room. It's not the judge. It's not even the moment when the whole courtroom went quiet. It's a 6-year-old boy in a gray jumper, standing on his chair because he was too small to see over the railing, pointing one small finger across a packed courtroom at a man in a tall black bearskin hat. And saying 4 words. 4 words that nobody in that room expected. 4 words that, within 48 hours, would be in every newspaper in the country. I was there, I saw it happen, and I've been trying to figure out how to tell this story ever since. Let me start at the beginning. Not the courtroom beginning, the real beginning. The one that happened on a gray Tuesday morning in late October, outside a building most tourists walk past without a second glance. I work as a freelance court reporter. Have done for 11 years. I cover civil cases, criminal proceedings, inquests, anything that needs someone in the room with a notepad and enough patience to sit through 6 hours of procedural argument without losing their mind. It's not glamorous work. Most days I'm scribbling shorthand about property disputes or planning violations and eating a sandwich from a paper bag in a waiting room that smells like old carpet. But occasionally, very occasionally, a case lands on the docket that makes me sit up straight. The Mallory case was one of those. Here's the background, as briefly as I can give it. A man named Gerald Mallory, 63 years old, retired civil servant, widower, had been charged with a serious financial offense. The specifics aren't mine to repeat in full detail here, but the broad strokes were this. A substantial sum of money, allegedly misappropriated over several years from a charitable trust set up in memory of his late wife. The beneficiaries of that trust, several small community organizations, and notably a children's hospice in Surrey, had been left shortchanged. Badly shortchanged. It was the kind of case that made people quietly furious. Not the explosive, headline-grabbing fury of a violent crime, something slower and colder. The kind of betrayal that sits in your stomach like something you can't digest. The trial had been running for 9 days by the time I arrived. I'd been brought in to cover the second week for a legal publication. The original reporter had taken ill. I'd read the transcripts from the previous sessions on the train in, squinting at my laptop in the gray morning light while the countryside slid past the window. The courtroom itself was one of the older ones. High ceilings with plasterwork that hadn't been touched since probably the 1950s. Long wooden benches in the public gallery that you had to kind of angle yourself into at a specific tilt to sit comfortably. The kind of room that feels like it takes cases seriously, like it's been doing this long enough to have developed a gravity of its own. When I arrived that morning, there was already a queue outside. That's the first thing that caught my attention, a queue. For a financial case, not even a criminal trial in the most dramatic sense, there were people waiting on the pavement outside the court building. Not a mob, not protesters, just ordinary people. An older woman in a green coat with a canvas shopping bag over her arm. A man in his 50s in a waterproof jacket, hands in his pockets, looking at his phone. A young couple I initially mistook for law students. And then, slightly separate from the others, a woman in her early 30s with a little boy beside her. The boy was wearing a gray school jumper over a pale blue collared shirt. He had dark hair that had been combed into a neat side parting that was already starting to lose the battle against gravity. He was holding his mother's hand with one hand, and in the other he was clutching a small toy. A little wooden horse, painted dark brown, slightly chipped on one ear. He was looking around at everything with enormous dark eyes. Not anxious, not bored, just absorbing. The way small children look at the world when they haven't yet learned to pretend they're not paying attention. His mother, I'd learn her name later, it was Diane Ockaffer, was talking quietly on her phone. She looked tired in the way people look tired when they've been tired for a long time and have mostly stopped noticing it. But she was put together. Neat clothes, careful posture. The kind of person who'd prepared for this morning the way you prepare for something important. I didn't know yet why she was there. I didn't know yet who the boy was. I just noted them the way I note everything, and shuffled forward in the queue. Inside, the courtroom filled slowly. The public gallery benches, there were 3 rows of them, separated from the main court by a low wooden partition and a pane of reinforced glass, were about half full by the time the clerk called the room to order. Diane Ockafer sat in the second row with her son beside her. She'd set him up with the wooden horse on the bench in front of him, and he was walking it back and forth along the wood, making it step very carefully, like he was concentrating on keeping it balanced. Nobody seemed to notice them particularly. People in public galleries at courts generally fall into two categories: people who are there because they have a connection to the case and people who are curious. You can usually tell the difference. The connected ones sit differently. Still, they hold their bags on their laps instead of putting them down. They don't check their phones. Diane Ockafer was clearly connected. I made a note of it and left it at that. The morning session was procedural. Submissions from the defense about the admissibility of certain financial documents. The prosecution pushing back with careful, measured arguments. The judge, a man named Hartwell, gray-haired, deliberate in speech. The kind of judge who makes you feel like every word he says has been weighed 3 times before he lets it out, listening with his hands folded in front of him. The little boy sat remarkably still for most of it. Occasionally his mother would lean down and whisper something to him and he'd nod. Once she produced a small pack of raisins from her bag, and he ate them one by one, very deliberately, still watching the room with those steady dark eyes. At around 11:30, there was a short recess. People stretched, went for water. The hum of the room changed from formal silence to the specific murmur of people who are temporarily allowed to be human again. It was during this recess that I first noticed the guard. He was standing just inside the main door of the courtroom, not the public entrance, the main floor entrance that led from the building's interior corridors. He was in full ceremonial uniform, the dark tunic, the white belt, the tall bearskin hat that added nearly a foot to his already considerable height. He stood with his hands at his sides and his eyes fixed somewhere in the middle distance, the way they're trained to do. He'd been there all morning, I realized. I'd registered him peripherally when I came in but hadn't focused on him. He was simply part of the backdrop, one of those elements of British institutional life that you notice and then immediately stop noticing, like red postboxes or the sound of Big Ben. But during the recess, with the room's formality momentarily suspended, he became more visible somehow. People walked past him, around him, near him. Some glanced at him. A few tourists in the gallery, I'd clocked them earlier by their cameras, and the way they'd been quietly delighted by everything, looked at him with the particular reverence that people who don't live here often feel toward the ceremonial figures of British public life. The little boy from his bench in the gallery was also looking at him. Completely still, not walking his horse anymore, just watching. I noticed, and then the recess ended, and the session resumed, and I went back to my notes. The afternoon session was different. The defense had called a character witness, a former colleague of Mallory's who spoke for about 40 minutes about the man's professional integrity and personal charity. The prosecution cross-examined with the quiet efficiency of someone who doesn't need to be theatrical because the facts are already doing the heavy lifting. Then there was a change in the schedule. The judge announced that a statement would be read, a written submission from a party who had requested anonymity but whose connection to the case the court had deemed relevant. It had been prepared in advance, reviewed by both sides, and would be read aloud by the clerk. This was unexpected. The barristers on both sides had known about it, you could tell, from the absence of surprise on their faces, but the public gallery had not. There was a ripple of straightening spines and uncrossing of legs, that heightened attention that comes when something shifts. The clerk stood and began to read. The statement was from a woman who had worked at the Children's Hospice. She described in plain and careful language what the shortfall in funding had meant, what it had looked like in practice, what had been lost. She didn't use dramatic language. She didn't need to. She just described specific things, a therapy program that had to be discontinued, equipment that hadn't been replaced, families that had been told certain services were no longer available. The room was very quiet, the kind of quiet that has weight in it. I looked across at the defendant. Gerald Mallory sat with his eyes down, his hands flat on the table in front of him. I couldn't tell what he was thinking. I'm not sure I wanted to know. And then I heard a small sound from the public gallery. It was quiet enough that I almost missed it. A little exhale, not quite a sob, more like the sound a child makes when they're trying very hard not to make a sound. I looked over. Diane Ockafer had her hand pressed to her mouth. The boy, her son, had stopped looking at his toy horse. He was looking at his mother. And in the way that children understand things through a different channel than words, through some emotional frequency that adults have mostly lost access to, he seemed to understand that something important was happening, that this mattered. He reached up with his small hand and put it on her arm. She took his hand and held it. I had to look away. I'm not sentimental, not really. This job cures you of sentimentality fairly efficiently. But something about that small gesture in that quiet room got through whatever professional distance I'd constructed around myself. I made a note, mother plus boy gallery connected to hospice, find out. The clerk finished reading the statement. The judge thanked the parties, conferred briefly with his clerk, announced that the session would break for the day and resume the following morning, when the defense would have an opportunity to address the submission. People began to gather themselves, papers shuffled, bags picked up. And then the boy, I still didn't know his name yet, stood up on his bench. Not climbed up, stood up, like he'd made a decision, like there was something he needed to see more clearly. His mother tried to get him to sit down, gently, the way you try to get a child to do something when you don't want to make a scene. She took his arm. But he wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the guard. The one in the bearskin hat, still standing by the door, still perfectly motionless. The boy stared at him for a long moment. And then he pointed. One small arm extended, one finger pointing clearly across the room. And he said, in a voice that was quiet but somehow completely audible in the settling hush of the courtroom, "That's the man who helped Mummy." Nobody moved for a second. Then several things happened at once. Diane Ockhafer put her hand on her son's shoulder, color rising in her face, embarrassment, or something more than embarrassment, I couldn't tell. The guard, for the first time since I'd been watching him, shifted, not much, just a fraction. His eyes moved almost imperceptibly to the boy. And then he looked straight ahead again. But the room had heard. The judge looked up from his papers. One of the barristers turned. I had my pen moving before I'd consciously decided to write anything down. "That's the man who helped Mummy." 4 words. And in the morning, everything changed. I found Diane Ockhafer in the corridor outside, sitting on a wooden bench with her son beside her. He'd gone back to his horse. She was staring at the middle distance, her bag in her lap. I introduced myself carefully, told her what I did, said I didn't have to write anything she didn't want me to write, but that I'd heard what her son had said and wondered if she'd be willing to talk. She looked at me for a long moment, then she looked at her son. "His name is Kofi," she said. "He's 6. I waited. "The guard," she said after a moment. It was a few months ago, before all this started, before the trial dates were even set." She paused. "We were outside the court building. I'd had a meeting with the solicitor, the legal team from the hospice, I mean. I worked there for 4 years, and I was upset. I was trying not to show it, but I was. And Kofi was with me because I hadn't been able to arrange childcare, and he'd had to sit through the whole meeting just being good like he always is." She pressed her lips together for a moment. "We came outside and I sat on the steps. I know you're not supposed to sit on the steps, but I needed a minute. And Kofi sat with me, and then he wandered a little, the way he does, not far, just a few feet. And he ended up standing next to one of the ceremonial guards, the one posted at the corner." She stopped. "What happened?" I asked. "He dropped his horse," she said. "Kofi did. It rolled right up against the guard's boot. And Kofi looked up at this enormous man in this enormous hat and said, very politely, 'Excuse me, could you move your foot?' A small smile crossed her face, tired but real. And the guard, who's not supposed to move, obviously, he looked down. And then he very carefully moved his boot, just an inch or two, so Kofi could pick up his horse." She paused. "And then he looked back up again like it hadn't happened." I thought about that. "But Kofi remembered," I said. "Kofi never forgets anything," she said quietly. "He's 6 years old and he has a memory like you wouldn't believe." She looked at her son. "He told me about it that evening, said one of the soldiers had been kind to him. I didn't think too much about it at the time." She paused. "But this morning when we came in, we've never been in this building before, he saw that guard standing there. Same uniform, same post. Maybe the same man, maybe not, I honestly couldn't say." She looked at me. "But Kofi was certain." I went home that evening with my notes and a feeling I couldn't quite name. It wasn't a story yet, or rather, it was a story, but I didn't know what kind. A child recognizing a guard, a small act of kindness months earlier, a grieving family and a trial about betrayal and money and a hospice that had been left short. These things were connected, but I wasn't sure yet how they connected, or whether the connection meant anything beyond itself. I sat at my kitchen table with tea. I forgot to drink and thought about Kofi's face when he'd pointed across that courtroom. Not triumphant, not performing, just certain. That's the man who helped Mummy. Children don't frame things the way adults do. They don't narrate with context or subtext. They just say the true thing. And that simple, direct certainty was what had made the room go quiet. I went to bed still thinking about it. The next morning I arrived early. I wanted to see if the same guard was posted at the door. He was. In the light of a gray November morning, before the public gallery filled, and before the lawyers arranged themselves, and before the formal machinery of the day started up, I had a clearer look at him. He was younger than I'd initially registered. Probably late 20s, though it was hard to judge with any certainty. The uniform has a way of flattening individual characteristics, making everyone who wears it part of the same long, continuous institution rather than a distinct person. He was tall, dark brows, a stillness about him that wasn't the rigid absence of movement you sometimes see in people performing duty under observation. It was something slightly different, something that felt more internal. He stood like the building was his responsibility. I thought about what Diane had told me. The boot moved half an inch, the horse retrieved, eyes back to the middle distance, like it hadn't happened. Except it had happened. And a 6-year-old had filed it away in that extraordinary memory of his, and carried it all the way into a courtroom 9 months later. I asked through the appropriate channels whether it would be possible to confirm the guard's schedule, which days he was posted, what his role specifically was. I was politely told that operational details of court security personnel were not made available to press. I'd expected as much. I asked whether the guard would be willing to speak to me, even briefly, even off the record. I was told this would be passed along, but that I should not expect a response. I didn't get one, not that morning. But I kept watching. Not intrusively, I wasn't there to make anyone uncomfortable. I just paid attention, the way this job has trained me to pay attention, to the small things in a room. The guard stood his post through the morning session without visible reaction to anything. Arguments from the defense. The judge's measured responses. The procedural machinery grinding forward. He stood through all of it with the same absolute steadiness. At one point during a slightly heated exchange between the prosecution and defense over a document, the judge raised his hand for quiet and the room settled. And I caught, just for a moment, barely perceptible something in the guard's expression. Not amusement, not judgment, something more like recognition, the look of someone who has learned to be patient with noise. Then it was gone. Kofi was back that morning too. With his mother. Diane Okafor had told me the evening before that she'd been asked by the legal team to be present for the week. She was a potential witness should certain matters require her direct testimony, though it was not certain she'd be called. So she was there, every day, in the second row of the public gallery. And Kofi was there because, as she'd explained with a kind of exhausted pragmatism, there was no alternative. He sat with his wooden horse and his careful stillness and his enormous attentive eyes. At the start of the morning session, before things formally began, I watched him look toward the door where the guard stood. Just one long, clear look, like confirming something. Then he went back to walking his horse along the bench. The guard, facing forward, would not have seen it. Or maybe he did. It's hard to know what people register in their peripheral vision when they've been trained to see everything without appearing to. The morning session brought a development nobody had anticipated. The defense introduced what they described as a piece of evidence that had not previously been presented, a series of financial documents that, they argued, demonstrated their client had in fact raised concerns internally about the management of the charitable trust before the alleged misappropriation occurred. The implication being that Mallory had not acted alone, or had not acted with the knowledge he was alleged to have had. The prosecution objected vigorously. The judge called both sides to the bench. There was a low, intense conversation I couldn't hear from the gallery. Then he announced that proceedings would pause while he reviewed the documentation privately and determined its admissibility. The room broke for an unscheduled recess. These unscheduled breaks have a different quality than planned ones. People don't quite know what to do with themselves. Some go for water, some check phones, some just sit in the particular limbo of waiting without knowing how long the wait will be. I was making notes from the morning when I became aware that something was happening near the door. Kofi had slid off his bench. He'd apparently told his mother he needed to use the bathroom. She'd had a brief conversation with a court usher who was now walking with them, and the route to the facilities apparently took them along the edge of the main court floor, past the guard's position. I watched from the gallery. Kofi, walking alongside the usher with his mother behind him, slowed as he approached the guard. He stopped. He looked up. The guard was looking straight ahead. And then Kofi, 6 years old, gray jumper, wooden horse still in his hand, did something that made the usher freeze and Diane Okafor put a hand over her mouth. He held up the wooden horse, not offering it, not thrusting it forward, just showing it, the way you show something to someone to say, "Do you remember?" The guard's eyes very briefly dropped. To the horse, then back up. Not a word, not a movement. But something crossed his face, something small and private and real. There and then gone, sealed back behind whatever discipline had built itself up over years of standing still in rooms where everyone else moved. Diane took Kofi's hand gently and moved them along. I wrote down what I'd seen and stared at it for a while. I found out his name that afternoon. Not through official channels, through the particular social ecosystem of courthouses, the clerks and ushers and legal assistants who have been in the building for years and know things that don't appear in any official record, and who occasionally, for reasons entirely their own, decide to tell you something. A woman named Patricia, who worked in the court's administrative office and had very specific opinions about the coffee machine on the second floor, stopped beside me in the corridor during the lunch break and said without preamble, "You're the reporter who's been watching Corporal Ademi." I looked at her. "I've been watching the case," I said carefully. She said, and then, "He's been posted here for 2 months. Before that he was at Horse Guards. Before that," she paused, seemed to decide how much to say elsewhere. "He doesn't talk about that." "Does he talk much at all?" I asked. "Not during duty," she said. "Obviously." She looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite categorize. "He came in early last week and helped one of our junior clerks carry 15 boxes of archived files up from the basement storage. Just offered. She'd been standing there trying to figure out how to manage it, and he walked past on his way in and just said, 'Shall I help with those?'" She paused. She said she nearly fell over. She looked at me once more. "That's the sort of man he is," she said. Then she went back toward the administrative office, and that was the end of the conversation. Corporal Ademi. I wrote the name down, looked at it. You understand by this point that the story I'd thought I was covering, a financial crime, a charity trust, a man in the dock, had quietly rearranged itself. It hadn't disappeared. That trial was real and serious, and mattered enormously to real people, especially to a woman named Diane Okafor and her 6-year-old son Kofi, and the staff and families of a hospice in Surrey. But something else had entered the frame. The story of a small act of kindness. A boot moved half an inch, a horse retrieved, a child who remembered. And a man standing perfectly still in a tall black hat, who may or may not have known that he was being watched and recognized, and in some way that I couldn't yet articulate, was about to matter more to this case than any filing system or financial document. The afternoon session resumed. The judge had made his determination on the new documents. He would allow them into evidence, but with specific limitations on how they could be used. The defense expressed measured satisfaction. The prosecution noted their position for the record with the specific careful language of people who are not done fighting yet. The atmosphere in the room had changed. There was a quality of recalibration, both sides adjusting their positions, reconsidering sequences. The judge had shifted the ground slightly, and everyone was finding their footing. Mallory at the defense table seemed more alert than he'd been the previous day. Not hopeful exactly. I've seen enough courtrooms to know the difference between genuine hope and the tactical performance of it. But something in his posture was different, more upright. I looked at Diane Ockefer. She was watching the proceedings with an expression I found impossible to read. Not angry. Not frightened, something more internal and more complicated. Kofi had fallen asleep. He was sitting straight up, which seemed improbable, but his eyes were closed, and his head was tipped slightly to one side, and the wooden horse was clutched to his chest. His mother had draped her cardigan over his shoulders without looking away from the proceedings. In the midst of all that formal complexity, that small, sleeping figure felt like something true. Something that the room, with all its arguments and counter-arguments and procedural chess, was ultimately about. Not Mallory, not the money, not even the trust. A boy who just needed his mum's work situation to resolve itself so she could stop looking tired. The session ended at 4:15. I was gathering my things when Patricia appeared at my elbow again. I hadn't seen her come in. "He knows," she said. I looked at her. Who knows what? "Ademi," she said. "He knows about the boy. Someone told him about what happened yesterday in the gallery." She paused. "He asked if the child was all right." I stared at her. He asked if Kofi was all right. He didn't know the boy's name. He just said the child in the gallery. She looked at me carefully. He didn't confirm or deny anything, if that's what you're wondering, but he asked if the child was all right. She left before I could respond. I stood there in the emptying courtroom with my notebook and the late gray light coming through the high windows, and thought about a man trained to hold absolutely still, asking quietly, through whatever indirect channel had become available to him, whether a small boy with a wooden horse was all right. That evening I called a colleague who'd covered the military courts beat for several years. Asked him about the specific regiment, about the ceremonial duties attached to civilian court postings, about what that would mean for someone with a combat background. He told me several things. He told me that the postings were sought after by some and avoided by others. That for some soldiers, the discipline of ceremonial duty, the absolute stillness, the external focus, was almost meditative. A way of being inside an institution that was larger than yourself and letting that largeness hold you. He told me that others found it difficult, that the contrast between the kinetic demands of active service and the absolute motionlessness of ceremonial posting could be jarring, that some men described standing in ceremonial dress while crowds moved around them as a kind of controlled exercise in existing without reacting. And the ones who are good at it, he said, the ones who are really good at it, they tend to be the ones who have figured out that the stillness is a choice, not an absence, a choice. I thought about that for a long time. The third day of my coverage, the 11th day of the trial overall, was the day everything came into the open. Not dramatically, not the way things come into the open in films, with sudden revelation and gasping audiences and someone slamming their hand on a table. This was a courtroom. Things came into the open the way they do in courtrooms, which is through patient, careful, procedural work that builds toward something quietly enormous. But there was one moment. And it involved a 6-year-old boy and a man in a bearskin hat, and 4 words that had been hanging in the air of that room since the previous day. Let me tell you how it happened. The morning began with testimony. One of the trustees of the charitable foundation had been called to give evidence, a woman named Mrs. Forsyth, early 70s, who had been on the board for 12 years, and had the particular quality of someone who has spent decades being underestimated and has entirely stopped minding. She gave her testimony with precision and clarity. She did not waver under cross-examination. She corrected the defense barrister once, politely but firmly, when he slightly mischaracterized a document she'd been asked about, and the barrister accepted the correction with a grace that suggested he knew when he'd been outmaneuvered. The gallery was fuller than it had been on previous days. Word had gotten around, in the way it does, through legal networks, through journalists, through the particular informal transmission system of people who follow cases and were now paying attention to this one. I recognized a few faces, another reporter I knew from the press box, a former colleague who covered charity law. And in the second row, in their now familiar spot, Diane Ockefer and Kofi. Kofi had his horse. He was alert, awake, watching everything. He'd noticed me, I think. He'd given me a careful, measured look when they came in and sat down that reminded me oddly of the way Patricia looked at people, assessing, without any performance of assessment. Then he'd gone back to his horse. The morning session finished, lunch recess. I went to find coffee and came back to find the corridor outside the courtroom had a different atmosphere. Quieter in a specific way. The way places get quiet when something is about to happen. A young solicitor I'd spoken to briefly the previous day caught my eye and made a small movement with his head. Not beckoning exactly, just indicating. I went over. "They've had a conversation," he said quietly. "Who has?" He looked at me carefully, deciding how much to say. Then, Ademi and Mrs. Ockafer. A pause. He asked to speak to her during the lunch break, or she asked to speak to him. I'm honestly not clear which direction it went. He paused again. But they spoke. "About what?" I asked. "About the boy's statement, the day before." He hesitated. "And about something that apparently happened several months ago that may be relevant to a part of the case I can't tell you about yet." I waited. "There's been a submission," he said finally, "to the judge for this afternoon's session. I don't know the content, but it came through official channels, which means it has to be addressed in court." He moved away before I could ask anything else. The afternoon session began at 2. The judge took his position. The barristers arranged themselves. Mallory sat at the defense table with his hands folded and the expression of a man who had been through 10 days of this and had learned to conserve himself. The clerk of the court stood. "My lord," he said, "before proceedings continue, there is a matter of correspondence received by the court this morning that both parties have been made aware of and have agreed should be addressed formally before today's session continues." The judge nodded. "There has been a written submission from a member of the court's security detail." A very slight shifting in the room. Nothing dramatic, just the collective movement of attention toward something unexpected. Corporal James Ademi, currently posted to this court, who has indicated that he possesses information relevant to the proceedings and requests the opportunity to provide a formal statement. In the public gallery, I heard Diane Ockafer make a very quiet sound. Kofi looked up from his horse. What followed was procedural. The judge conferred with both parties. The prosecution had been informed. They indicated cautious interest. The defense expressed more explicit interest, which itself told you something, though what exactly I wasn't sure yet. After a recess of 20 minutes, it was determined that Ademi's statement would be received and read into the record. He was not being called as a formal witness. That process would have been more involved, more time-consuming, requiring advance notice and vetting. But a written statement from a court officer who'd requested to submit information was a different matter. That, the judge determined, fell within his discretion to admit. The clerk was given the document. He stood, he adjusted his reading glasses. The room waited. I'll tell you what the statement contained, as best I can reconstruct it from my notes, and from what was subsequently made available. Approximately 9 months before the trial date, Corporal Ademi had been posted outside the building where several of the preliminary legal consultations connected to this case had taken place. He hadn't known at the time that the meetings he was positioned near had any connection to a future court case. He'd been doing his duty, stationed, watching. During one such afternoon, he had observed, through the glass frontage of the building, an altercation in the entrance lobby. He'd noted it, as he noted everything. A man, he described him with specificity. Build, approximate age, clothing, manner, had approached a woman who appeared to be leaving a meeting, attempted to speak with her, and when she declined and moved toward the door, had followed her in a way that Ademi had categorized in his own mind, in the moment, as potentially intimidating. The woman had come out onto the steps. The man had not followed her outside, he'd stopped at the door. But Ademi had watched him stand there for several minutes, watching her. At the time, he'd stayed alert, but there had been no incident, and his brief that day hadn't included building interior monitoring. The woman had left. The man had eventually gone back into the building. Ademi had logged the observation in his own personal notes, a habit, he stated, that he'd developed during active service when making sense of what you'd seen mattered. He hadn't made any formal report. There hadn't seemed to be grounds for one. But he had described the man, and his description matched, in significant detail, a person who had subsequently become relevant to the case. Not Mallory, a secondary figure. One of the people the defense had referenced in their new documentary evidence, someone who had, they were claiming, also had access to and knowledge of the trust's finances. Ademi had not known any of this until, and here was the part that made the room go genuinely quiet, until the previous morning, when he'd heard a small boy in the public gallery say that's the man who helped Mummy. He'd looked at Diane Aucaffer, he'd recognized her. She was the woman from the steps. You have to understand what this meant in context. The defense had been arguing that Mallory had not been the sole decision-maker, that there was another party involved, someone who had also had access, also had knowledge, also had motive. They had documents suggesting it, but they didn't have a witness. They didn't have anyone who could place that other party in direct proximity to the legal process, behaving in a way that suggested awareness and perhaps intent. Ademi's statement, 9 months old, written in his personal notebook, logged not as evidence but as instinct, was not, on its own, definitive. Courtrooms don't work on single statements. The judge was careful about that. But it was something. It was something that opened a door that the defense had been pressing against, and the prosecution had been holding shut. It changed the shape of the afternoon. I watched Mallory as the statement was read. His solicitor had leaned close to him at some point, and I'd seen him listen, and then, very briefly, close his eyes. Not relief, quite. More like the particular feeling of a pressure that has been building for a long time slightly releasing. One small valve opening. It wasn't vindication. It wasn't an ending. The trial would continue for another several days. There were more arguments to be made, more evidence to be examined. This was not a film. The resolution would not arrive neatly by evening. But something had shifted. I looked at the guard, at Ademi. He was standing in his position by the door, same posture, same forward gaze. But something was different, and I couldn't have told you exactly what. It wasn't visible in any specific way. It was more like the air around him had changed temperature slightly. Like something had been said that needed to be said, and the saying of it had settled something. He was still completely motionless, but it didn't feel like the stillness of absence anymore. It felt like the stillness of someone who has done what they needed to do. Kofi had been watching the proceedings with the focused attention he seemed to bring to everything. He didn't understand the legal language, obviously. He was 6. But he understood the room's mood, the way children always understand mood before they understand content. He could feel that something had happened. At one point during the afternoon, during a brief pause while the judge reviewed a document, Kofi leaned toward his mother and said something quietly. She listened, then smiled, a real smile, the first uncomplicated one I'd seen from her, and pulled him gently into her side. Later, she told me what he'd said. He'd said, "Is the soldier going to be okay?" Not did he help, not did it work. Not anything connected to the case, or the legal proceedings, or the complicated adult machinery around him. Just, is the soldier going to be okay? I requested, through every proper channel available to me, an opportunity to speak with Corporal Ademi. I was told, again, that operational details and personnel conversations were not available. I accepted this. But on the final day of my coverage, the Friday of that week, I was leaving the building at the end of the session, and he was finishing his shift at the door, being formally relieved by a colleague. The exchange was brief and entirely ceremonial. His colleague stepped into position. He stepped out. And for the first time in 4 days, he was simply a man in a corridor, carrying his bearskin hat under his arm. He saw me. He didn't slow down. But he did, as he passed, make eye contact. I didn't say anything, neither did he. But I nodded, and he nodded back. That was all, that was the whole of it. The verdict came 7 days later. I wasn't in the room for it. My coverage had ended, and the publication had sent another reporter for the conclusion. But I read the report carefully. Gerald Mallory was found guilty on the primary charges, though the jury had reached what the report described as a nuanced determination on several counts, reflecting, clearly, the complexity introduced in the second week. The judge's sentencing remarks reportedly acknowledged that the case had illuminated a wider pattern of mismanagement that went beyond a single individual. A second investigation was opened into the conduct of another party associated with the trust. I won't say who, but you can probably guess. Diane Ockhaffer sent me a brief message a few weeks later. She'd found my contact details through the publication's website. She said she appreciated that I'd written the piece with care. I'd filed a feature about the case, and specifically about Kofi's moment in the gallery, and I'd been careful about what I included and what I left private. She said Kofi was doing well. He'd started a new term at school. He still had the wooden horse. I think about Corporal James Ademi more than I expected to. Not the dramatic version, not the guard who changed everything, not the hero, not the military figure who rode to the rescue. Those framings all flattened something that was actually more interesting than any of them. What he did wasn't dramatic, it was careful. He'd watched and noted and carried a small piece of information in a personal notebook for 9 months without knowing what it was for. And when the moment came, prompted of all things by a 6-year-old's clear and uncomplicated certainty, he'd simply passed it forward through the appropriate channels. He didn't perform it. He didn't make it about himself. He just passed it forward. That's the thing about certain kinds of duty that I'd never fully understood before that week. The visible part, the stillness, the uniform, the bearskin hat, the ceremonial weight of it isn't the whole of it. It's almost the surface of it. Underneath, at least for the ones who are really doing it, there's something much quieter and much more demanding. The commitment to pay attention, to notice, to carry what you notice responsibly. To move your boot half an inch when a boy needs to pick up his horse. And then to stand back up and look forward again. Kofi is 7 now. He started telling people he wants to be a soldier when he grows up, or a vet. He's not entirely decided. His mother says he still talks about the man with the big hat. Not with drama, not as a story he tells for effect. Just the way you mention someone you haven't forgotten. There's a version of this story where everything lines up perfectly, where the child's words trigger a revelation, the guard delivers justice, the verdict is clear, and everyone goes home knowing exactly what happened and why. That's not quite how it went. It went quieter than that, more sideways, more human. A boy remembered something kind. A man had written down something true. And a courtroom, just for a moment, made space for both. That's all, and somehow that was enough.